Ted Cruz did not enter that hearing room, hunting for the cheap line, the easy insult, or the television moment in which one senator labels another a liar so that the next 24 hours dissolve into arguments about tone rather than substance. He chose something far more damaging. Instead of asking the audience to trust his accusation, he brought the Democratic Party's own language into the room, pulled their previous arguments into the light, and forced Adam Schiff to sit across from words his own side had already placed on the public record. The issue was universal injunctions, the extraordinary power of a single federal district judge to issue an order whose consequences reach far beyond one courtroom, one district, or one set of plaintiffs. Cruz's point was brutally simple. Democrats had condemned that power when conservative judges used it, yet suddenly defended it when liberal judges used it against Donald Trump. No complicated theory was required to understand the contradiction. No constitutional seminar was necessary to recognize the change. The tool had not changed. The authority had not changed. The number of Americans affected by one judge's order had not changed. The only meaningful difference was political control, and Cruz was preparing to make Schiff explain why a judicial weapon described as dangerous under one president had somehow become a constitutional safeguard under another. Cruz had arrived early. The preparation visible on his desk already told the story before the hearing formally began. Papers were squared neatly in front of him, two separate stacks arranged with the kind of precision that suggested this would not be an improvised exchange built around applause lines. One stack was thick, another was noticeably thinner. The thinner stack sat on top. Cruz appeared almost indifferent to it, because according to the structure of the confrontation, the work had already been done before Adam Schiff ever entered the room. Schiff arrived with the controlled confidence of someone deeply familiar with congressional hearings, cameras, staffers, microphones, procedural combat, and the peculiar rhythm of Washington rooms where people often speak for the clip as much as they speak for the record. He settled into his chair without visible urgency, adjusted the microphone, exchanged the ordinary acknowledgments expected in a Senate hearing, and carried himself like a politician entering territory he had crossed many times before. That confidence mattered because the entire first phase of the hearing depended on the contrast between how comfortable Schiff appeared at the beginning and how much narrower his available answers became once Cruz stopped arguing theory and started comparing position. The subject before the Senate Judiciary Committee was the growing use of nationwide or universal injunctions against Trump administration policies, orders issued by individual district judges that could effectively block federal action across the entire country. Rather than merely resolve the dispute immediately before that court, Cruz framed those injunctions not as ordinary judicial review, but as what he described as the second phase of lawfare. An effort to continue through carefully selected courtrooms what political opponents had failed to accomplish through elections and criminal prosecutions. His argument was deliberately stripped of academic decoration. Voters elect a president. Presidents implement policy. Courts may review whether that policy is lawful, but there is an obvious institutional difference between judicial review and allowing one strategically selected judge to freeze national policy for everyone. Cruz then turned to the numbers, contrasting the relatively limited number of nationwide injunctions during Barack Obama's 8 years with the much faster pace of such orders during Trump's early months in office. He did not need to pound the desk or dramatize the statistic, because the statistic itself was being used as the accusation, a numerical suggestion that the mechanism was no longer an occasional remedy, but an increasingly routine political instrument. Schiff's response followed the line Democrats had been using publicly. The problem was not the judges, he argued, but an administration allegedly violating the Constitution so aggressively that courts were repeatedly forced to intervene. It was a polished counterattack, because it shifted the focus away from the structure of universal injunctions and toward the merits of the Trump administration's conduct, allowing Schiff to present the judges not as political actors, but as constitutional restraints against unlawful executive power. In another exchange that might have been enough to create two competing narratives, one side accusing judges of overreach and the other accusing the president of lawlessness, with each camp leaving the room satisfied that its preferred arguments survived. Cruz refused to remain inside that comfortable debate. He did not challenge Schiff by asking whether courts possess legitimate authority to stop unconstitutional conduct, a proposition Schiff could defend for hours. Instead, he asked why, if the law was truly as clear as Schiff claimed, Democratic attorneys general and litigants kept pursuing cases in jurisdictions where they were more likely to encounter ideologically sympathetic judges rather than simply filing wherever the alleged constitutional violation could properly be heard. That question cut directly into the practical behavior behind the lofty language. If constitutional illegality were really obvious on its face, Cruz argued, then the identity and geography of the judge should matter far less than Schiff's theory implied. Why repeatedly travel past conservative districts and Trump-appointed judges to reach favorable jurisdictions if the legal case was so overwhelming that any competent federal judge should recognize it? Schiff began responding with the language available to any experienced attorney, discussing federal litigation, invoking jurisdiction, standing, procedural requirements, and the complexities involved in deciding where a particular case can properly be filed. Those considerations were technically relevant, but Cruz's challenge was not whether jurisdiction exists as a legal concept or whether federal litigation can be complicated. Nobody in the room needed Schiff to explain that lawsuits have procedural rules. The challenge was whether the repeated geographic pattern undermined the claim that these were simply neutral constitutional disputes naturally finding their way before whichever judges happened to receive them. Cruz then moved from the general pattern to a concrete example, pointing to a district judge in a Democratic-leaning jurisdiction whose order had frozen congressionally appropriated funds on a nationwide basis rather than limiting relief to the parties or geographic area directly before court. One courtroom, one district judge, one order, and a consequence extending across a country of roughly 330 million people. That became the central image Cruz used to strip away the abstraction. He described that arrangement as policy by geography, a phrase designed to emphasize that the practical result could depend less on Congress or the electorate than on finding the courthouse most likely to produce the desired national order. Schiff returned to separation of powers, checks and balances, and the judiciary's responsibility to protect constitutional boundaries against executive overreach, arguments that remain coherent as general principles, but did not directly eliminate the asymmetry Cruz was highlighting. The more Schiff defended judicial authority in the abstract, the easier Cruz found it to drag the exchange back toward the concrete question of why that authority appeared to receive different moral descriptions depending on which party was being restrained. Under the American system, Cruz argued, voters choose a president, the president exercises lawful executive authority, and courts intervene when necessary to enforce legal limits. But the legitimacy of that system becomes strained when a single judge chosen through predictable litigation strategy effectively determines policy for the entire nation. He looked directly at Schiff and sharpened the dispute into a question of consistency. Does the principle remain the same when the judge is politically favorable, or does the definition of judicial overreach quietly change with the outcome? That was the crack opening in Schiff's answer, because Cruz was no longer asking him to defend courts, constitutional review, or separation of powers, all of which could be defended without difficulty. He was asking Schiff to explain a political reversal, and that is harder. Abstract principles can absorb endless rhetorical decoration. A reversal can be tested against a document, a date, a quote, and a signature. Schiff straightened the papers in front of him and continued answering through precedent and institutional theory. But the more technically complete those answers became, the more obvious Cruz's underlying accusation remained. The theory had stayed stable, while the political application had changed. That distinction was crucial, because Cruz was not yet accusing Schiff personally of fabricating evidence, manipulating intelligence claims, or misleading the public about investigations. None of the material that would later dominate the confrontation had entered the room at this stage. He was establishing a simpler foundation, showing the audience how easily Washington can transform a procedural power from a constitutional outrage into a constitutional necessity without changing anything except the partisan direction of the ruling. The hearing therefore began with judges, injunctions, venue selection, executive authority, and the increasingly familiar spectacle of national policy being halted by a single district court order. But Cruz had prepared something beyond theoretical argument, something far more difficult for Schiff to answer with generalized language about constitutional safeguards. Sitting on the desk was the thin stack of papers Cruz had barely touched. Once he reached for it, the argument would stop being about what Democrats claim to believe now and start becoming about what they had already said when the exact same judicial power was hurting them. Cruz opened that thin stack deliberately and announced that he wanted to read something while making absolutely clear who had said it, because the next phase depended entirely on removing the usual escape route that allows politicians to dismiss criticism as partisan Republican rhetoric. These were not going to be Cruz's descriptions of Democratic hypocrisy, and they were not going to be conservative commentators paraphrasing liberal positions for an audience already inclined to agree. He was preparing to use statements from Democratic senators, Democratic press conferences, Democratic legal filings, and Democratic lawmakers themselves, all condemning the nationwide reach of individual district judges when conservative rulings produced outcomes they opposed. The genius of the move was not theatrical and did not depend on volume. Once the words were authenticated by the people now standing on the opposite side of the principle, Cruz no longer needed to manufacture the contradiction. He only needed to read the record back into the room and let Adam Schiff explain why yesterday's threat to constitutional order had become today's celebrated defense of the rule of law. Cruz began with Chuck Schumer in April 2023, when a federal judge in Texas had issued a ruling aimed at mifepristone on a nationwide basis, and Schumer responded by condemning the idea that one judge could effectively override policy for the entire country. The significance was not hidden inside obscure legal terminology, because the Democratic objection at that moment was precisely the objection Cruz was making now. One federal district judge should not possess unchecked practical power over millions of people far beyond the immediate courtroom. Then Cruz moved to Dick Durbin from the same period, another senior Democrat, describing the ruling as a draconian decision by a single federal judge seeking to deny millions of women access to an FDA-approved medication. Cruz did not need to rewrite either argument, because the Democratic language had already been strong enough, and every sentence carried considerably more weight now that the same party was defending nationwide judicial intervention against a Republican administration. The point was becoming painfully difficult to blur. When the outcome threatened a Democratic priority, one judge acting nationally was portrayed as an abuse of judicial authority. When the outcome restrained Trump, that same structure suddenly arrived wrapped in the language of constitutional necessity. Cruz kept reading, and the thin stack on his desk became more damaging with every page, because he was no longer dealing with one isolated statement from one senator spoken during one angry press conference. More than 250 Democratic lawmakers had participated in a formal legal brief warning the Supreme Court about the consequences of allowing a single district judge to impose nationwide policy through one injunction, and their warning went directly to the structural problem Cruz had been describing. They had treated that concentration of judicial power as dangerous to the constitutional order, not merely inconvenient in one specific case, which made the present reversal much harder to excuse as a difference over the merits of Trump administration policy. Cruz looked across the room and reduced the contradiction to its simplest form when a conservative judge used the mechanism against a policy Democrats supported. Democrats called it judicial tyranny, while liberal judges using comparable nationwide authority against Trump were defended as protectors of the rule of law. The documents were doing what argument alone could not do, because they prevented Schiff from pretending Cruz was inventing a Republican standard and forced him instead to confront a Democratic standard that had already been written down, signed, filed, and publicly defended. Schiff responded by emphasizing context, distinguishing between what Democrats regarded as lawful government action and what they regarded as unlawful executive conduct, and returning again to the judiciary's obligation to restrain constitutional violations. That answer allowed him to maintain that identical judicial tools can carry different legitimacy depending on the legality of the government policy being challenged, but it did not erase the broader institutional warning his own party had previously made about nationwide injunctions themselves. Cruz understood the difference and therefore did not interrupt, because the longer Schiff explained context, the more clearly the audience could compare his current defense with language Democrats had previously used to condemn the underlying power. This was not a shouting match where interruption could rescue either side from scrutiny, and Cruz appeared perfectly content to let Schiff build a lengthy answer around distinctions, while the written record remained sitting untouched between them. Schiff could argue that the cases were different, but he could not make the earlier quotes disappear, and that was the entire tactical value of bringing receipts instead of accusations. Cruz reached for another page and returned to Democratic statements from April 2024, criticizing right-wing activists for exploiting the judicial system and unelected judges for overriding decisions with nationwide consequences. Again, the language was not mild, cautious, or technical, because Democrats had spoken as though concentrating national policy power in one district judge presented a genuine Democratic problem. Cruz placed that statement with the others and reminded Schiff that these were not Republican inventions, but the words of Schiff's political allies, colleagues, and lawmakers who had previously urged the courts to restrain this exact judicial practice. More than 250 Democratic lawmakers had told the Supreme Court that universal injunctions were dangerous, and now prominent Democrats were standing behind the same mechanism because it was being directed against a president they opposed. Same tool, same reach, same ability of one judge to affect hundreds of millions of Americans, and one glaring political variable had changed: which side benefited from the order. Cruz did not inflate the conclusion because it did not require inflation. He simply observed that the judges performing the act had changed while the basic judicial power remained the same. That sentence mattered because it closed the first argument without requiring Schiff to admit hypocrisy, since the documentary record already allowed the audience to reach that judgment without his cooperation. Everything to that point had involved constitutional structure, nationwide injunctions, venue selection, judicial authority, presidential policy, and whether institutional rules should remain stable when political advantage changes hands. Then the atmosphere shifted because Cruz set aside the paper he had been reading and moved away from the current dispute over judges toward Adam Schiff's own record. The transition was unmistakable. Cruz had finished demonstrating inconsistency in the Democratic position, and now he was preparing to ask whether the same pattern of selective standards appeared in Schiff's public conduct over the previous several years. Cruz began with Russia, returning to statements Schiff had repeatedly made on national television while serving in a position that gave those statements extraordinary authority in the public mind. Schiff had told Americans that he had seen evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and had described that evidence as being in plain sight language that sounded especially consequential because it came from the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. The public could not independently inspect everything Schiff had access to, and that asymmetry mattered, because his credibility rested partly on the implication that classified briefings and committee access allowed him to know things ordinary Americans could not verify for themselves. Cruz therefore did not merely dispute Schiff's political judgment, but focused on the evidentiary claim itself, asking what ultimately supported the certainty with which Schiff had spoken. Years later, with major investigations completed, Cruz now had a record against which those television declarations could be measured. He invoked Robert Mueller's investigation, which lasted 22 months and involved extensive investigative activity, including large numbers of subpoenas and witnesses, before producing a report that did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. Cruz emphasized that formulation because he wanted the dispute anchored in the special counsel's conclusion rather than reduced to another partisan characterization from a Republican senator. If Schiff had repeatedly told millions of Americans that evidence of collusion was visible and substantial, Cruz's question was brutally straightforward. Where was the evidence that justified those repeated claims? Schiff could discuss suspicious conduct surrounding circumstances, obstruction questions, political behavior, and the larger environment around Trump, but none of those subjects automatically answered the narrower claim Cruz was putting on the table. Cruz was forcing a separation between what Schiff believed Trump had done politically and what Schiff had publicly implied he could substantiate as evidence of coordination with Russia. Then Cruz moved to special counsel John Durham, whose investigation examined the origins and conduct of the Russia investigation and whose findings Cruz used to deepen the challenge to Schiff's earlier certainty. According to the record, Cruz invoked the FBI lacked verified intelligence at the opening of the investigation, while the Steele dossier that became central to public controversy contained unverified allegations and had been funded through the opposing political campaign. That did not merely create an argument about whether investigators made mistakes, because Cruz was connecting those findings directly to years of public claims made with a level of confidence that had shaped national political debate. Schiff had spoken again and again as though the underlying case were not speculative, not uncertain, and not dependent on disputed material, but something obvious enough to describe as evidence sitting in plain sight. Cruz now wanted that confidence reconciled with the investigative record produced after the cameras, headlines, interviews, and political consequences had already accumulated. Schiff leaned toward the microphone and answered more aggressively, returning to Trump's conduct, the Mueller report's discussion of obstruction, and the broader pattern he believed justified intense scrutiny of the former president. The response carried the familiarity of an argument Schiff had delivered many times before, polished through years of television appearances and congressional confrontation. But Cruz was deliberately narrowing the aperture so those broader themes could not substitute for the specific evidentiary question. He was not asking whether Trump behaved responsibly, whether Trump welcomed political advantage, whether investigators had reasons to examine particular conduct, or whether Schiff personally regarded the president as dangerous. He was asking why Schiff repeatedly represented evidence of collusion as something effectively established before the investigations had produced the proof necessary to sustain that confidence. Every additional subject Schiff introduced could therefore sound less like a rebuttal and more like movement away from the one question Cruz refused to abandon. For years, Schiff had possessed one enormous advantage in public debates over intelligence matters. He could invoke information, briefings, and investigative context that the audience itself could not fully see, creating an authority gap between the official speaking on television and the citizen listening at home. Cruz was now attempting to collapse that gap by placing completed investigative findings beside Schiff's earlier declarations and asking the simplest possible evidentiary question a politician can be forced to confront after years of certainty. Show where the claim ended up. Show what survived examination. Show why language that sounded definitive at the time should still be treated as definitive after Mueller and Durham had completed their work. Schiff could continue widening the discussion toward Trump's behavior, but Cruz kept shrinking it back toward the original representation made to the public. And just as the argument over universal injunctions had become dangerous for Schiff, once Cruz introduced his own party's written record, the Russia argument was about to become even more difficult when Cruz moved from television claims to a document Schiff himself had helped put before the American people. That document was the February 2018 memorandum connected to the surveillance of Carter Page, and Cruz's transition to it was important because the argument was moving away from rhetoric and toward a written defense of a government process that could later be compared with an inspector general's findings. Devin Nunes had raised alarms about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act applications used to obtain authority to surveil Carter Page, arguing that the process contained serious problems and omitted important information. Schiff's side produced a rebuttal defending the conduct of the FBI and Department of Justice, presenting the surveillance process as fundamentally legitimate rather than the abuse Nunes was alleging. Years later, Inspector General Michael Horowitz examined those same applications and identified 17 significant errors and omissions, creating another direct collision between Schiff's earlier assurance and the findings that emerged after formal review. Cruz had already shown that Schiff's party could reverse itself on judicial power, and now he was preparing to ask something far more personal. What happens when a man who assured the country that a secret surveillance process was sound is confronted with 17 documented reasons that assurance did not survive inspection? 17 significant errors and omissions were not the kind of finding that could be dismissed as a typo, a paperwork problem, or a harmless bureaucratic mistake buried inside a complicated surveillance process. The FISA system operates behind closed doors, with targets unable to appear before the court and challenge the government's representations in real time, which means accuracy is not optional decoration, but the central condition that makes the process defensible at all. When the Inspector General later identified 17 significant problems in the Carter Page applications, the discovery went directly to the heart of the assurance Schiff and his allies had previously given the country that the process had not been abused in the way Devin Nunes warned. Cruz did not need to transform those findings into a broader conspiracy theory because his narrower point was already severe enough. Schiff had access to classified information, saw the dispute from inside the Intelligence Committee, rejected the warning publicly, and defended a process that later failed formal inspection on issue after issue. That left a question more damaging than whether Schiff had simply been wrong, because Cruz was asking how someone with privileged access could speak with such certainty while 17 significant problems were sitting inside the very applications being defended. Cruz emphasized that the presiding judge of the FISA Court had publicly stated that the FBI had misled the court, adding institutional weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as partisan disagreement between competing congressional memos. The problem was therefore no longer Nunes saying one thing and Schiff saying another, because an independent inspector general had examined the process and the court itself had confronted deficiencies in the information supplied to it. Cruz kept returning to the same brutal contrast that had already worked against Schiff on universal injunctions and Russia. Compare what was said when the controversy was politically useful with what the record showed after investigators finished looking. Schiff had told the public that the process was clean enough to rebut accusations of abuse, but the later record described 17 significant errors and omissions, and no amount of polished language could compress that number into something trivial. In a surveillance system where the government asks a secret court for permission to monitor an American citizen, 17 was not a cosmetic flaw in the presentation. It was a direct challenge to the confidence Schiff had projected when he assured the country that the process had worked. Cruz then moved toward the episode that carried even greater symbolic weight because it had unfolded openly on camera before the American public rather than inside classified briefings or secret surveillance applications. He paused the progression of documents, closed the folder in front of him, and shifted his focus to the 26th of September 2019, when Schiff was chairing the House Intelligence Committee during testimony connected to the Ukraine whistleblower complaint. By that point, the White House had already released the public readout of Donald Trump's call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, meaning the actual text was available to lawmakers, reporters, and ordinary citizens who wanted to compare public descriptions with the document itself. Schiff, nevertheless, delivered a dramatized rendering of Trump's words, including language about demanding that Ukraine manufacture dirt on a political opponent, and he did so from the chairman's seat in a formal congressional hearing. Cruz's reason for returning to that moment was not complicated. Schiff had spent years insisting that words, evidence, intelligence, and institutional credibility mattered. Yet here was a documented instance in which the words he presented as a version of the president's conduct were not the words contained in the released call record. Cruz read back the relevant portion, slowly not expanding it, not decorating it, and not allowing the exchange to escape into a vague debate over impressions of the call. The distinction he wanted the room to confront was precise. The language Schiff delivered did not appear in the official readout, was not copied from a government document, and had been written as a dramatized characterization rather than a quotation from the president. Schiff's later defense was that he had been using parody to capture what he considered the essence of Trump's conduct, but Cruz treated that explanation as an indictment rather than an escape because of the setting in which the performance occurred. This was not a comedy stage, campaign rally, private fundraiser, or cable television panel where exaggeration and sarcasm might be immediately understood as rhetorical devices. It was the House Intelligence Committee. Schiff was the chairman. The subject involved presidential conduct and national security, and the authority of the setting gave every sentence an institutional seriousness that made the later appeal to parody sound less like clarification and more like damage control. Cruz's accusation sharpened around that institutional responsibility, arguing that the American people had not given Schiff a congressional platform and access to sensitive intelligence so that he could create words and place them into the public discussion as though they reflected the president's actual language. The force of the criticism did not depend on claiming the entire Ukraine controversy was imaginary, because Cruz's point was narrower and more difficult for Schiff to evade. Whatever one believed about Trump's conduct, the words Schiff dramatized were not the words contained in the released call readout. Schiff pushed back by arguing that his characterization captured the substance and essence of what Trump was attempting to accomplish, shifting the dispute away from literal quotation and toward interpretation. His voice became harder, his gestures broader, and the exchange moved from the controlled rhythm of legal argument into the visible frustration of a politician defending not merely a policy position, but his own conduct under direct scrutiny. Yet the more Schiff emphasized that the dramatization represented what he believed the call really meant, the more Cruz could return to the distinction between interpretation and quotation, because one can argue endlessly about meaning, while the existence or absence of actual words remains a matter of record. The hearing room tightened around that distinction, and the dramatic advantage Schiff had enjoyed in 2019 was gone because the actual call readout had long been public and the argument was no longer unfolding in the fog of an emerging impeachment controversy. Cruz did not interrupt every sentence, did not compete for volume, and did not need to invent a new accusation, because letting Schiff explain the parody defense only reinforced the central fact that the language had been constructed rather than lifted from the document itself. The gavel came down during the exchange, cutting through the rising intensity, and the cameras narrowed their attention toward Schiff as he continued attempting to justify the representation through its supposed accuracy and substance. What had once been presented as a devastating rhetorical summary of Trump's behavior was now being examined under a very different standard, not whether it sounded persuasive, but whether a committee chairman had blurred the line between interpretation and documented quotation at a moment when the country was being asked to judge a president. Cruz let several seconds of silence pass after Schiff's response, allowing the absence of the disputed words from the call record to carry more weight than another burst of argument would have added. Then Cruz delivered the rebuke that condensed his entire case against Schiff's handling of the episode. The American people had not elected him to write fiction, and they had not entrusted him with sensitive responsibilities so he could manufacture language and attribute it to the president. The sentence mattered because it connected the Ukraine episode with everything Cruz had already raised, from injunctions to Russia to FISA, through one recurring criticism about the relationship between political certainty and the evidentiary record. Schiff attempted to reestablish his broader argument by returning to threats to democracy, authoritarian behavior, accountability, and the obligation of public officials to confront abuses of power. Those were themes Schiff had used repeatedly throughout the Trump era, and they remained rhetorically familiar, but in the immediate context, they did not remove the factual issue Cruz had just placed directly in front of him. Cruz was not asking whether Trump deserved criticism. He was asking whether Schiff's willingness to portray disputed claims with certainty had repeatedly exceeded what the record could ultimately support. The crucial difference in that hearing was that Schiff could no longer rely on the timing advantage that had protected many of his strongest public statements when the controversies were still developing, and definitive reports had not yet been completed. Mueller was finished. Durham was finished. The Inspector General's review of the FISA applications was finished. The Ukraine call readout had been public for years, and the gap between initial rhetoric and later documentation could now be displayed in one continuous sequence. Cruz used that sequence less like a prosecutor unveiling one spectacular piece of evidence and more like an accountant reconciling years of statements against the final ledger. Each individual episode could be defended with context, nuance, interpretation, political judgment, or disagreement over what particular conduct meant, but the accumulation made those defenses increasingly costly because every new explanation required another exception to Schiff's earlier certainty. The problem Cruz was building was not one isolated quote, but a pattern in which sweeping public claims repeatedly arrived before the documentary record was settled and remained politically useful long after later findings complicated or undermined them. Schiff tried again to move the argument toward the danger he believed Trump represented because that was the strongest terrain available to him and the terrain on which he had built years of public messaging. Cruz did not follow him there, and that refusal was strategically important because the entire hearing would have dissolved into another generic Trump debate if he had allowed the conversation to become a contest over which politician posed the greater threat to democratic institutions. Instead, Cruz stayed with the narrower issue of evidentiary responsibility the standard applied when a powerful committee chairman speaks with the authority of privileged information and the consequences when that certainty outruns what investigators and official records eventually establish. The room no longer needed another accusation to understand the argument because the sequence itself had already become the accusation. Universal injunctions condemned and then defended, collusion evidence proclaimed and then demanded, a FISA process defended and later found riddled with significant errors, a presidential quotation dramatized and later excused as parody. At that point, Cruz stopped pressing for one more dramatic answer, because the structure had already done the damage and the hearing could move forward without him announcing a victory the record had been assembled to imply. He moved to the next item rather than turning the exchange into a theatrical celebration, and that restraint gave the conclusion more force because Schiff remained seated with the same papers, the same microphone, and the same institutional title, while the authority behind his earlier certainty had been systematically challenged. Nothing physically changed in the hearing room, yet the meaning of the scene had changed entirely from the opening minutes when Schiff entered as a seasoned senator prepared for another familiar constitutional argument. Cruz had started by asking whether Democrats applied the same rule to universal injunctions, regardless of which president suffered the consequence, and he ended this phase by applying that same consistency test to Schiff's own record. If standards matter, they have to matter when the facts become inconvenient. If evidence matters, it has to matter after the investigations conclude as much as when accusations dominate television. And if congressional authority carries special weight, then the people exercising it carry a special obligation not to blur political interpretation with established fact. The hearing moved on, but Cruz's case against Schiff was no longer confined to one policy dispute, because the next question hanging over the room was how a record like that had produced not accountability, but continued promotion. The larger question hanging over the hearing was no longer whether Adam Schiff could survive one uncomfortable exchange with Ted Cruz, because Schiff had survived far more politically dangerous moments than a hostile line of questioning in a Senate committee room. The real question was how a record containing so many disputed claims, reversals, failed predictions, and later corrections had produced so little institutional cost for the person who made them. Schiff had spent years speaking with the authority of the House Intelligence Committee, appearing before national audiences, describing evidence that ordinary Americans could not inspect, and presenting conclusions with a confidence that depended heavily on the assumption that his access made him more trustworthy than the people questioning him from outside the room. When later investigations complicated or undermined those claims, the political system did not force a corresponding reckoning with the original certainty, and that disconnect became the final target of the script's argument. Cruz's confrontation mattered not because one hearing could erase 7 years of political history, but because it placed the old statements and the later record in the same room at the same time without a television host available to redirect the conversation and without a new controversy arriving fast enough to bury the previous one. That is why the media environment surrounding Schiff became impossible to separate from the political career he built during the Trump years. He appeared repeatedly across national television, sometimes with extraordinary frequency, and those appearances gave him an enormous platform to repeat allegations, interpretations, warnings, and claims about evidence that viewers themselves could not independently test. The central criticism is not merely that cable networks invited a Democratic congressman onto television because that is routine politics, but that the fundamental evidentiary challenge was too rarely pressed with the intensity Schiff's certainty deserved. If a public official says the evidence exists in plain sight, then the obvious journalistic question is equally plain. What evidence precisely and how much of it can be shown? Instead, the accusation here is that Schiff's authority often substituted for verification, allowing the claim itself to become news while the burden of proving it remained somewhere off camera. That structure created a feedback loop that was politically powerful, because repetition can make an unresolved claim feel increasingly established even when the underlying evidentiary foundation is not changed. Schiff would make a declaration. The declaration would become a headline. The headline would generate another interview, and the next interview would begin from the assumption created by the previous one. Millions of viewers, therefore, encountered the same basic allegations through different broadcasts, panels, clips, and headlines until the volume of coverage could easily be mistaken for the volume of proof. By the time Mueller completed his investigation, by the time Durham finished examining the origins of the Russia probe, and by the time the Inspector General documented 17 significant errors and omissions in the Carter Page FISA process, the political value of the original claims had already been extracted. The correction phase was quieter than the accusation phase, and that imbalance is exactly what allowed Schiff to move forward without paying anything close to the reputational price that might have followed if the later findings had received the same intensity as the earlier accusations. The party structure around Schiff reinforced that protection rather than challenging it. Nancy Pelosi selected him to serve as the lead manager in Donald Trump's first impeachment, giving him one of the most visible prosecutorial roles available to any member of the House and effectively placing his judgment at the center of a historic constitutional confrontation. That appointment did not communicate hesitation about Schiff's record. It communicated confidence in his usefulness, discipline, and willingness to articulate the Democratic case with maximum force. When the House later censured Schiff in June 2023, Democrats did not distance themselves from him or treat the vote as a moment requiring introspection. They surrounded him, defended him, turned the punishment into another political fight, and transformed what Republicans intended as institutional condemnation into a demonstration of partisan solidarity. That reaction matters, because accountability only works when a penalty carries consequences beyond the ceremony in which it is imposed. A censure that immediately becomes a fundraising message, campaign argument, and symbol of loyalty to one's own side can function less like punishment and more like political fuel. Schiff went on to win the California Senate race, entered the Senate, and obtained a seat on the Judiciary Committee, meaning the arc runs not from accusation to investigation to penalty, but from accusation to controversy to censure to promotion. That progression is what makes the argument larger than Ted Cruz and Adam Schiff as individual politicians. The claim is that Washington's incentives rewarded aggression, certainty, and partisan usefulness far more consistently than they rewarded restraint when the underlying facts were still unresolved. From that perspective, Schiff's controversial statements are presented not as random verbal mistakes scattered across years of chaotic politics, but as calculated risks made inside a system that rarely punished the calculation. Every television appearance offered another opportunity to reinforce a narrative before the public possessed the full evidentiary record, and every delay in the investigative process increased the amount of time those claims could operate politically without final resolution. By the time reports arrived months or years later, the country had usually moved to another scandal, another hearing, another emergency, another cycle of outrage, and the original declaration had already performed its intended function. The harshest judgment, therefore, is not that Schiff occasionally spoke too strongly, but that certainty itself became a political instrument useful, precisely because the audience could not immediately verify what an Intelligence Committee chairman claimed to know. In that environment, being corrected later was far less dangerous than being cautious early. Ted Cruz's role in the hearing was to reverse that advantage by assembling the later record and placing it next to the earlier certainty while Schiff was physically present and required to respond. Cruz did not need secret information to do it, and he did not need a revelation nobody had ever seen before, because the force of the confrontation came from arranging familiar material in a sequence that made the contradictions harder to compartmentalize. Democratic warnings about universal injunctions were placed beside Democratic defenses of universal injunctions. Schiff's claims about collusion were placed beside the Mueller and Durham records. Schiff's defense of the FISA process was placed beside 17 significant errors and omissions, and Schiff's dramatized Ukraine language was placed beside the actual call readout. None of those items by itself ended Schiff's career, erased his political support, or settled every dispute surrounding Donald Trump. Together, however, they created a picture of a politician whose public certainty repeatedly deserved more scrutiny than the institutions surrounding him had been willing to provide. That is also why the hearing is treated as meaningful, despite the acknowledgement that Cruz did not suddenly transform the political system in one afternoon. No republic is repaired by one senator reading documents across a committee table, and no media culture reverses years of incentives because one exchange produces an uncomfortable clip. What happened was smaller, but smaller does not mean irrelevant. Cruz forced claims that had spent years being separated by news cycles, investigations, committee fights, and changing political contexts into one continuous confrontation where Schiff could not simply move from one subject to another without the previous record following him. The value of the moment was not theatrical victory, but compression. 7 years of disputes were reduced into a series of questions that required the man who had made the statements to sit beside the conclusions that came later. For viewers who had doubted Schiff's declarations long before those investigations were completed, that compression carried a particular emotional charge. Many Americans had listened to claims of evidence in plain sight and wondered why the evidence itself remained so difficult to identify in concrete terms, only to be told that skepticism reflected ignorance, partisanship, or a failure to understand classified information. Years later, official findings supplied details that made some of those early doubts look considerably less irrational than they had been portrayed at the time. The history turns into a blunt message. People who questioned the certainty were not necessarily rejecting facts. In many cases, they were asking for proof before accepting conclusions that powerful institutions had already begun treating as settled. Cruz's hearing room strategy was effective because he gave that skepticism institutional form, converting years of private frustration into questions asked directly across a Senate desk. Schiff remained a senator when the hearing ended, retained his title, retained his political allies, and walked out of the room with his career intact. So anyone pretending the confrontation literally destroyed him would be confusing rhetorical impact with actual institutional consequence. But the final point is different and more durable. Authority becomes weaker every time the public sees that confidence and evidence are not the same thing. A committee chair can invoke access. A television network can amplify the claim. A party can defend the speaker, and a political career can continue advancing. But none of those things permanently erase the documentary record once it becomes available. The next time Schiff speaks with the same absolute certainty, the audience has more history against which to measure it. That is ultimately what Cruz placed on the table. Not a new scandal, not a secret file, and not a dramatic revelation created for the cameras, but a sequence of existing statements and existing findings arranged so the distance between them could no longer hide behind time. The universal injunction argument exposed a partisan reversal. The Russia discussion exposed the gap between public certainty and final investigative findings. The FISA section exposed the consequences of defending a process later found to contain 17 significant problems. And the Ukraine episode exposed the danger of presenting dramatization with the authority of a congressional chairmanship. Schiff answered, defended himself, widened the context, invoked Trump's conduct, and returned to the larger democratic concerns he had spent years emphasizing. But the underlying record remained where Cruz had placed it. And that is the final judgment left behind. Once the evidence is on the table, rhetoric can surround it, explain it, contextualize it, or attack the person presenting it, but it cannot make the record disappear.